back to the Culture Codex podcast. Today I'm joined by Bryan Hambley, a Democratic candidate for Ohio's Secretary of State, in what's shaping to be one of the most competitive primary races in the state. The Secretary of State isn't always a headline position, but it sits at the center of how democracy actually functions. Bryan is stepping into this race at a moment where trust in elections is being tested and where the responsibilities of this office are being looked at more closely than ever. So, Bryan, thanks for joining me, man.
Thank you for having me. It's really a joy to be here.
And I can see you're already on the campaign trail. You're in a Sheetz parking lot, going all across Ohio. So, yeah, it's great to see, man.
I have an 8-year-old daughter, and as I was leaving, I asked her to guess where we were going, and she said Cleveland, because we're always driving to Cleveland right now.
Nice, man. And for people just getting introduced to you, who are you and what led you to run for Secretary of State?
My name is Bryan Hambley. I'm a leukemia doctor at the University of Cincinnati, and I'm running for Secretary of State because I think our elections ought to be honest and fair. I don't think that's a minority opinion. I don't think it's a partisan opinion in Ohio, but boy, it'd be a huge change from what we've had the last 16 years. And so that's what draws me into this race.
Obviously, this isn't exactly the most high-profile office, especially to the average voter. So why did you choose Secretary of State specifically?
Well, I'll tell you one funny story. In the 1980s, I think it was when Sherrod Brown was running for one of the Secretary of State races he was in. They did a poll of Ohio voters, and they asked him, what does the Secretary of State of Ohio do? And they gave him 3 options. First, they're in charge of election procedures in Ohio. All right, the right answer. Second, that they are the head of the Office Secretaries Association of Ohio. And third, that they are Ohio's representative to the United Nations. And most Ohio voters in that survey said that they are Ohio's representative to the United Nations, which the person who was telling me this was trying to emphasize. Most voters won't know when they vote what the Secretary of State does and won't be able to describe all the different powers that the Secretary of State has. And so a campaign really has to be about connecting with people, telling stories, hearing about what are their concerns and connecting those concerns to what you could do in office for them and what's not going well in their communities. I'll say the Secretary of State has 3 main powers that I think everyone should know. One, they are supposed to draw fair districts. Second, they're supposed to write honest ballot language when you vote on a constitutional amendment. And third, they're supposed to make it easy and fair for everybody to vote. That is the meat and potatoes of the job.
How much influence does this office have over elections compared to what people assume?
So I'll say the biggest reality in Ohio's democracy is gerrymandering. And what gerrymandering is where politicians draw their own districts rather than citizens picking their own districts. Ohio has one of the most gerrymandered congressional map and state senate maps in the entire country. Not every state does it like this. In Ohio, people have identified this problem, especially democracy advocates, League of Women Voters, those folks. And so in 2024, I was involved organizing nurses and physicians, along with tens of thousands of volunteers around the state of Ohio who were active on an anti-gerrymandering constitutional amendment. Our Secretary of State, though, controls the ballot language that appears when you go to vote and you flip your ballot over for usually that last issue or 2. And they wrote incredibly confusing half-page of ballot language that was designed to confuse Ohio voters. And that ballot initiative failed. That constitutional amendment failed. And I believe it failed because our Secretary of State put his thumb on the scale to prevent citizens from having their way.
Oh, yeah.
So I believe the first power of the Secretary of State to improve our elections and improve our democracy is honest ballot language so we can finally get rid of gerrymandering in Ohio.
What do you think are the most misunderstood parts of the job of SOS?
I think because of the last 7 years, we've had a Secretary of State who's really used the job to follow whatever President Trump has wanted at different stages. Because our Secretary of State, he's not interested in being Secretary of State. He wanted to be a Republican senator from Ohio. And so he was willing to send Ohio voters data to the federal government, which he didn't have to do. Second, he was willing to make it harder for people to vote, kicked a lot of people off voting rolls, especially if you live in Democratic areas in our state. That is not actually the job. That is what our Secretary of State currently has made the job, because he wants to be a United States Senator or governor of the state of Ohio. And the only way to do that right now is to do whatever Trump says. And so I want people to know that the Secretary of State, we had a great Secretary of State 20 years ago, Jennifer Brunner. Jennifer Brunner was even-handed. When she was chairing the ballot board that wrote that language, there were Democrats and Republicans on that board. When a Republican member was running late, Jennifer Brunner texted that member asking if there were any particular parts of the language or meeting that he wanted her to hold off on until he could arrive.
Wow.
So it wasn't that long ago
Yeah.
that we had a Secretary of State who just saw the job as making sure that the elections ran smoothly, fairly, and didn't advantage or disadvantage either political party. It can be done.
For sure. And it's funny, this goes directly into my next subject here. So the current Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, gave Ohio election data to the federal government. Is this legal? And what do you think the bigger play is here?
Yeah. I know the ACLU is looking at legality. Unfortunately, we may have trouble getting a successful lawsuit forward. And the Department of Justice, unfortunately, already has that file now. Our secretary, he did it. He already sent the file. And he did it quickly because he didn't want a big discussion around it. What every Ohio voter needs to know is that file included all voters in the state of Ohio, including personal information, like the last 4 digits of your Social Security number. Now, that gets to your question about what's the bigger play. The Social Security Administration in the United States does not keep updated citizenship information. When people retire and are about to collect Social Security benefits, that is when the Social Security Administration will review citizenship status and update their system. What I am very worried is that they are going to use this data, Ohio voters' private data with the last 4 of their Social Security, to identify naturalized citizens who became citizens 5, 10, 15 years ago, but send a list to the states calling them, because of the Social Security Administration's data, likely non-citizens or possible non-citizens. And what this would then do is allow states to say naturalized citizens had to come in a second time to the Board of Elections, provide additional documentation that they are naturalized. Now, why would they do this? There are hundreds of thousands of naturalized citizens in the state of Ohio. They tend to vote more Democratic. And if you add another hurdle for that group in particular, maybe they can gain 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 votes by that kind of policy change. I think that is the play that we all need to be looking out for.
And at one point, does this cross the line into election interference?
There's already been talk about policies that I think are election interference. Posting ICE officials or officers at polling locations, it is absolutely just intimidation. These officers have no role in polls. I am a poll worker in Warren County. We don't need an ICE officer. I can't imagine what in the world they would be trained to do that could assist the running of elections, which are run by county boards of elections in the state of Ohio.
Right.
The only reason Republicans are suggesting posting ICE officers at the voting rolls or at the polls would be to intimidate certain groups who might be a little worried. And if you're a naturalized citizen, let's say you're from Mexico and you became a citizen 3 or 4 years ago, boy, you probably still get a little squeamish if you're going somewhere where there's a bunch of people who are masked with guns on that say ICE, even if you're now a naturalized citizen. We know who this is designed to intimidate. That is election interference.
Yeah. The trust is collapsing all across the country, whether you're Democrat or Republican. And from your perspective, what's actually driving that distrust?
Misinformation and corruption. And I'll say a little more about both of those. One, our Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, knows that Ohio's elections are free, fair, and accurate. He knows that. But when he was running for the United States Senate, he went on cable news and insinuated that there was large-scale voter fraud. Now, why would Frank LaRose do that? Not because he thought there was a lot of voter fraud in the state of Ohio. In fact, he knows there's not. But because he thought it would help him with the far, far right wing of his party, and that would help him win a Senate primary. It just didn't work. So misinformation is a huge key here. Second, corruption. Since Citizens United, corporations have had far too much power in our politics. Whether this is First Energy, whether this is any of the natural gas companies that are trying to frack in our state parks, whether this is groups that are polluting the water outside Marietta with these injection wells where polluted wastewater from fracking is re-injected at very high pressures into the ground, and it gets through the into the groundwater. Corporate PACs don't donate because they like somebody. They donate because they want something. The Secretary of State is in charge of campaign finance in the state of Ohio, and I passionately believe if you want to be Secretary of State, you should not take any corporate PAC money. Those are the two things, corruption and misinformation, that have really, I think, seeded distrust in election. And a lot of people my age and younger, a lot of folks have stopped voting or stopped engaging in our democracy, and that's a very worrisome trend. We've got to do better so that we can stop that trend.
Absolutely. And you yourself, you're running a grassroots campaign. You're committed in not taking corporate PAC money. What responsibility does the Secretary of State have in rebuilding that trust with the people?
I'll say two things on that as well. One, when we came out saying this, as I was a first-time candidate, leukemia doctor, who was going to run a grassroots campaign and reject corporate PAC money, the number of people who would ask a question saying, well, that's really cute of you, but that's just not how it works, Bryan. You can't raise any money if you're going to say who you won't raise money from. Well, 16 months on, we have now raised over $1 million, more than any Democrat for this office at this point in history. And it was announced last Wednesday that in the first quarter of 2026, we outraised every candidate for Secretary of State, Democrat and Republican. We outraised a Republican frontrunner by about $30,000 in the first quarter.
No kidding.
It is unheard of for a Democratic candidate statewide in a Republican-held state to outraise the Republican frontrunner. Now, that's taken a lot of work. We're on the way to Youngstown. It'll be our 382nd event.
Wow.
A lot of these have been house parties, and we raise $500, $800, $1,100.
Right.
These aren't big ticket events. It's, free will offering, really. But with that work, we have absolutely proven those people wrong who said you have to take corporate PAC money to raise money. And I'd encourage any candidates that are listening or people who volunteer on campaigns that take notice of that. If you do the work ethic, you don't have to take that money. The second thing is, what can the Secretary of State do to repair that trust? I think we need an even-handed and nonpartisan group that investigates campaign finance violations. We used to have it. Republicans, unfortunately, in the budget in 2025, moved campaign finance into the Secretary of State's office, where the Secretary of State would be the controlling voter, the deciding vote on many of these investigations. I think that is wrong. I think what we need to do is have a nonpartisan approach. And as Secretary of State, if there are particularly partisan or acrimonious issues that come up on a campaign finance side, I will look for retired judges or other less partisan folks to sit on those committees to guide things rather than me in my office, since I'll be a Democrat in that office.
Right. Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. And what are the biggest barriers to voting right now, in your opinion?
I'll say three things on that. One, it used to be nonpartisan to register people to vote. When Sherrod Brown was Secretary of State in the 1980s, you could register to vote with a application that was printed on McDonald's placemats. And to this day, there are still voter registration forms that they've kept at the Secretary of State's office that have ketchup stains on them.
That's awesome.
Now, that requires the Secretary of State, who believes in registering people to vote. It also requires McDonald's and corporations and nonpartisan groups to say that, hey, registering people to vote is not a Democratic or a Republican activity. This is just civic duty.
Right.
We need to get back to that. Second, So beyond registering, we need to make sure that we're not removing people on an unwarranted basis from the polls. Our Secretary of State removed us from a bipartisan group of states that created something called the ERIC system, where if you move from one state to another, when you registered to vote in California after moving from Ohio, for instance, California would register you in, and Ohio would get a list that would take you off the voter rolls in Ohio. It was working great. Our Secretary of State moved us out of the ERIC system because he was about to run for Senate, and a Republican right-wing website called the ERIC system a liberal conspiracy. Keep in mind, there were Democratic and Republican states in that. The Secretary of State, by directive, can re-enter the ERIC system. That is what we should do, not this partisan approach to updating the voter rolls. The third thing, I believe we should have same-day voter registration and automatic voter registration. States that see a 3 to 5% increase. Democrats and Republicans in those states like it because it's just one less form. It's one less hassle, one less line to stand in.
Right.
Republicans, Democrats, Independents, nobody wants to sign an extra form and you can just click a box. Other states do that. To really push that over the finish line, though, we've got to prioritize getting rid of gerrymandering in Ohio because currently we don't have a legislature that would even consider that.
Yeah, I mean, gerrymandering has got to be the biggest problem here in the state, I'd say. We need to tackle corporate PAC money. We need to tackle, foreign influence as well. So that's why I appreciate you, running grassroots campaigns because that's what we need more of right now, honestly, man. I mean, it's just.
Yeah. And one thing to add to that on grassroots is I think a lot of Democrats, when I was traveling around Ohio, they're tired of the only thing they ever hear from a politician being a text message or an email that says, give us $3, deadline at midnight,
Right.
emergency, emergency, emergency. This is the only way you can fight Trump. And I understand it. We send some emails. We send about 2 to 3 fundraising emails per month. But we've thought that's the right amount, not every single day. And we never send text fundraising emails. We haven't sent one. We only send text messages to tell people, we're doing this event in your area. Early vote is open in your area. We haven't sent one fundraising email by a text message. That has put more stress on us to raise money, calling people and having people at events. But if you do enough events, people like that they got to know you. And then, no, they don't donate $3 on the way out. They donate 25 or 50 or 100. And you didn't have to spam 10,000 people to get that donation. And so it takes a while to build that, but it has built. And that is why we've been so successful the last 6 months in fundraising.
And I guess next we can talk about power, oversight, accountability, those sort of things. What checks currently exist on the Secretary of State's power? Because, as we see Frank LaRose here in Ohio, his actions, it's just like, okay, where are the checks and balances here? So are there any?
There are two main ones. One is the Secretary of State's about a $60 to $70 million a year operation. About 150 employees. About 2/3 of that revenue comes from business services, paperwork, things that are filed with the Secretary of State's office. New business licensing goes through the Secretary of State's office. It's an important part of the job, but it's of course the less sexy and less relevant to the health of our entire democracy.
Right. Yeah.
But 1/3 of the budget actually goes through the legislature. And so that is one check on the Secretary of State's power. I am very worried if we were to win the Secretary of State race, but Amy Acton is not elected governor, that Republicans in the legislature would use the budgetary process to try to, tamp us down if we're pushing an anti-gerrymandering constitutional amendment. One problem at a time, though, since no Democrat has won this office in 20 years.
I know, right? Yeah, one problem at a time, right? So this kind of goes into my next question. So in your opinion, you don't really think those checks are strong enough then, overall?
One specific thing I deeply disagree with. is in the 2025 budget. The Ohio Election Commission, that was a group outside of the Secretary of State's office, was pulled into the Secretary of State's office. That was deliberately done because two Republican legislators who broke the rules on campaign finance didn't like that this independent group gave them. It was just a slap on the wrist. Nobody went to jail, but they didn't like that they even got a slap on the wrist for filing incorrect paperwork. And so I think that is a mistake. I think we need a nonpartisan group that is investigating Democrats or Republicans who break campaign finance rules.
Like I said earlier, this race is one of the most competitive Democratic primaries in the state. What separates you from your opponent, Allison Russo, who I've also interviewed?
Yeah, and I'll say we respect each other. I didn't announce in January of 2025 I was running for Secretary of State to run against Representative Russo. I announced because I thought our democracy was broken and leaving issues like healthcare policy and public education funding behind. Representative Russo has made the case that we should nominate the person who's been in elected office for the most number of years, because that's the only experience that matters. My position is that the vision you would do in the office matters a lot more. We have two key policy differences. First, we disagree on gerrymandering. Unfortunately, in 2023, Representative Russo voted with Republicans for unconstitutional gerrymandered maps. I agree with the League of Women Voters. That vote was a mistake. Second, on corporate money in our politics. To Citizens United, as we were talking about a minute ago, I think corporations have way too much power. And if you're running, especially for Secretary of State, you shouldn't take corporate PAC money. Unfortunately, Representative Russo accepted $2,500 from a natural gas drilling company the day she announced for Secretary of State. That same company gave the same amount of money to the Republican, Robert Sprague. I don't think anybody, Democrat or Republican, should be accepting that money. Those companies know how to pull those strings. We should sever as many of the strings as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, man. How do you convince voters to care about an office they rarely think about? So,
well, I'll tell you if we pull it off. So I'll tell you what our strategy is, and then you can evaluate it. I have been at half of the county party chicken dinners across the state of Ohio. And I've observed something amongst Democrats that I think is a huge problem. You know, it's a Friday night. You've got 150 people who come in, spend their Friday evening, donate $40 to the county Democratic Party to get their dinner. And then you have a candidate, state rep, state senator, mayor, whoever, who comes to the front of the room to speak. And then they take this group of engaged 150 people, and they start to recite every policy position they've ever had. And they get deep into policy weeds very quickly. And they'll say, House Bill 172, this paragraph does this thing. And I think we need to blah, 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 blah. And at this point, I have stopped watching the politicians when they're going into this kind of a speech, because nothing interesting is going to happen at the podium. I look at the audience, and boy, the eyes are glazed over. Half the group is down in their phones wondering when in the world this is going to be over. And the reason is because that politician has never told a story. They've never connected emotionally with the audience, and they haven't talked about the values that lead them to the policy positions. Democrats are much worse about this than Republicans. If we don't connect why I believe healthcare is a human right, then say the 14 policy positions, that's not going to connect with people. We have to do better at connecting at an emotional level. The second thing, Ohio remains a pretty mainstream state. In recent elections, it's been about 54% Republican, about 46% Democrat. This is not a heavily Republican state, but Republicans have won most of the recent statewide elections. But if you look at our policies and what our legislature does, our legislature on many issues, including public education, is to the right of Mississippi. We are on the far right wing of American politics. The key reason for that is gerrymandering.
Yeah.
A secondary reason for that is that Democrats have not been able to win a handful of races where they could compete or at least force Republicans to a good faith negotiation. And so that's where we are. We have far right policy with voters who want something different. It does give us a political opportunity this year. We have an opportunity to connect with people.
What are your top priorities in your first year as Secretary of State?
Number one is to rerun in 2027 an independent redistricting commission as a constitutional amendment. I think the Secretary of State should have two roles in this. One, fair, honest ballot language. The Secretary of State controls ballot language in the state of Ohio. Second, though, I believe, the Secretary of State has a day job. That can't be partisan, but evenings, weekends, oh boy, I think the Secretary of State should be expending political capital to push for that independent redistricting commission. If we don't have a leader, it will not win. And political capital is something that Democrats and Republicans are both used to just trying to accumulate for careers that span decades. We need to stop that. Political capital is for spending. If I gain the political capital of winning a statewide race for the first time in 20 years in Ohio, I know what I want to spend it on. It's a constitutional amendment to get rid of gerrymandering. Second goal for the year, re-enter the ERIC system, where states cooperate on information. I believe every state, all 50, should be in the ERIC system, where when you move, both states update their voter rolls. It just makes sense. Third, I think we need to do a body of democracy reforms that make it easier to register and to vote for all citizens across the board. There's little ones that go under that, and some of them would require the legislature, but those would be the three priorities that first year.
And in 10 years, how should Ohio elections feel different to voters? Would this fundamentally change how the state operates at the polls and just for the new generation signing up to vote?
Yeah. The broad vision is that nobody should ever stand in line more than 20 minutes to cast their ballot, and nobody should have to drive more than 20 minutes to drop their ballot off. This is nonpartisan. We have a lot of counties that are very large counties in Ohio where the county seat is on the far northern or southern part of the county. And it can be a 40 or 45-minute drive sometimes from one part of the county to the Board of Elections. Nobody wants to drive an hour and a half round trip to drop off their ballot. Those counties should be able to add a second drop box at the other end of their county. It would help rural Republican counties and urban counties like Cuyahoga. For the life of me, a county over 1 million people has a single drop box. That doesn't make any sense. So nobody should wait more than 20 minutes to vote. Nobody should have to drive more than 20 minutes to drop off their ballot. The last thing I'll say, what does it look like different for the average Ohio voter? Now, I was in Van Wert, and I was meeting with some nurses at the Van Wert Regional Hospital. It's a hospital that serves several counties around it. And in 2020, Van Wert Regional built a new OB ward because women who were expecting babies were having to drive to Toledo an hour away or Fort Wayne an hour and 10 minutes away from Van Wert. In 2022, though, Ohio Health bought Van Wert Regional. And in 2023, on one-day notice, Ohio Health closed the OB ward at Van Wert Regional, telling women, some of these are women in their third trimester, the phone number and address of the Fort Wayne and Toledo OB clinics. The nurses at Van Wert Regional requested a meeting with their state representative. Just a state representative. This is the only hospital in this entire district. That state representative wouldn't even meet with the nurses at Van Wert Regional Hospital. That's what gerrymandering does. It makes politicians completely unresponsive to the voters. Most of those nurses probably voted for this guy. But that politician in a gerrymandered system, his power is linked to whoever's drawing the maps. And if as a Republican, he steps out of line from the power brokers in Columbus, he's going to find himself drawn out of his map the next time. This is not hypothetical. They drew a Republican state senator in Dayton's neighborhood out of his district because he didn't vote the way that the Republican leadership wanted. I think it's a key reason we need a democracy where those politicians have to meet with those nurses and hear their concerns, and then make a decision.
If people want to get involved, I'm on the ground a lot. I see a lot of the young people getting involved in your campaign. Where can people follow your campaign and volunteer over the next 5 days of early voting?
There's one thing we need. We need people to email team@hamblyforohio.com and in the subject line, write poll greeting. On May 5th, 80% of primary votes will be held. We have a link. If you email the team at hamblyforohio.com, email with the subject line poll greeting, we will email you back the link to sign up. And what you would do is for 2 or 3 hours on May 5th, you would hand out our information and smile at people as they arrive to vote. We think for a down ballot office, that could make the difference in a very close primary.
That's great, man. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Bryan, seriously, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know you're on the road. I know you're busy. Every time I call somebody, they're either in a vehicle or they're at some like fundraiser. So yeah, I really appreciate you joining me, man.
We've built a great team and we are going to leave, no stone unturned. We feel like we're hitting on all cylinders at the perfect moment.